Good afternoon, good lunchtime. Thank you for joining us today. We've invited Dr. Tracy Gershwin to do a presentation for us that we feel is very valuable for our stakeholders that live within our state. These webinars will be located and archived on our website, which is www.okserc.org. And we encourage you to share these videos and use them in the future for training. We're glad you're with us today to hear this important information. I'm going to introduce Tracy and then let her tell you a little bit about herself. She has many ideas that line up in the same category of what we do here in our center, and we're really excited to share this information with you today. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you, Joanne and Rob and everyone for joining me and all of you today, where we are going to talk about trust. So let me pull up my slideshow and then I will go ahead and I'll get started with introducing myself. So first, I am Dr. Tracy Gershwin, and I'm a professor at the University of Northern Colorado, where we are expecting snow today. And so you've got the beautiful university behind me. That's not what it looks like today, but it does look like that on a nice spring or summer day, some winter days. I've been at UNC since 2004, so nearly 18 years. My background is as a special education teacher and as a behavior analyst. So you're going to hear a lot of the behavior analyst in me coming out today as I talk about family professional partnerships, which kind of sounds a little odd, but it will make sense along the way. I coordinate our board certified behavior analysis program at UNC, as well as conduct research on family professional partnerships, specifically focusing on alternative dispute resolution and prevention practices. And one of those is building trust. So today's objectives are very simply aligned here, is that first, I am going to define trust for the family professional partnership, talking to you more about what trust looks like, what that means, and why we're even talking about trust today. The second thing is talking about the importance of trust and what that means to the family professional partnership. Then we will identify barriers to trust when it comes to the family professional partnerships. We will follow that with describing the relationship that exists between trust and conflict between families and professionals. And finally, we will be applying strategies used to develop and nurture trust. So I like to always start a little bit with my background and how it led me here. So I just briefly described to you that I am both a teacher by heart and a behavior analyst, which means that my passion lies in keeping relationships strong so that student outcomes can be what we would like them to be academically, socially, behaviorally, and all of the different ways that we want to see our student growth. But then as a behavior analyst, I know that there's a science that is required in many ways if we want to change behavior. And so in many ways, I've had a lot of conflicts in my own internal growth as a professor who researches family professional partnerships and as a behavior analyst simultaneously, because as a behavior analyst, when we want to change behavior or we want to see any behavior, we know that we need to describe it in a way that is observable and measurable, so we know exactly what that behavioral expectation is. And yet, when it comes to family professional partnerships, when it comes to dispute resolution, or in many cases, what I like to really emphasize is prevention, conflict prevention, a lot of those family professional partnership skills and strategies that we see that are identified in research are not detailed in the observable and measurable ways that we would like to see when we're looking at changed behavior. So I've worked directly with families in the schools, homes, and the community. And throughout my experience, I've experienced this research to practice gap where, as an educator, when I was a pre-service teacher, back when I was at Syracuse University years ago, I was learning to be a special education teacher. I learned all of the research-based best practices when it comes to working with families, to partnering for IEPs, for 504s, for all of the conversations, critical conversations we have that are linked with student success and outcomes that we want to see. I learned all those great practices, and then I went into the field of teaching. I went back to my home state of California, and I experienced a huge research to practice gap, which was that none of the things that I had been learning about in college or seen were happening in real time in the way that I thought that they should. And so much of my career has been trying to bridge that practice gap. So I'm hopeful that today's strategies will help you bridge some of that gap when you feel like you've heard these are how partnerships should look like, but how do I get there? What are the actual observable and measurable behaviors I can exhibit as a partner with educators, families, et cetera, for whomever is at the table? That includes all of the different partners that are at the table when it comes to partnering for students' outcomes. I also want to say that throughout the presentation, I will be using the term family professional partnership. And I just want to recognize there's many different ways that people have been to have described this relationship. I've heard family school, different components. I'm using family professional partnership universally as a way to represent all of the different professionals that may be involved with working with families during this partnership. So families and parents will be used interchangeably, as well as teacher, educator, and professional will be used interchangeably. So as you hear me speak and you think about your own role, I hope that you're able to find where you fit within this dynamic. And if this is something that you would use as a training for yourself, also think about how others could be visualizing their self in this partnership. And then finally, and most important, students should always be considered first and most important of this partnership. So as I talk about family professional partnerships and prevention of conflict, as well as resolution of conflict through a trusting foundation, please know that I am consistently thinking about, and I hope that you're all consistently thinking about, the student who should be at the very center of all of these discussions and needs, and in many cases, as much as possible, invited to the table to these conversations. In fact, a lot of research, some research is starting, not a lot because we need more, but some research is starting to show that when the student is at the table, IEP table, 504, or just conversation table with families and professionals, that everyone tends to behave a little bit better, students tend to be involved more, and there's a better outcome for all parties involved. So let's talk about what is trust and why on earth am I learning about trust today in this webinar? Why are you here to learn about trust? Well, in my experience, as a young doctoral student, when I started years ago, I wanted to look into specifics as to why families and professionals were repeatedly coming into hard conversations, challenging conversations, where in many instances, teachers are leaving the field. There's burnout that's associated with a poor relationship between a family and a professional, and families are feeling overwhelmed, having to spend money or excessive emotional costs and time to address issues. Throughout all of my research about conflict between families and professionals, two words that show up the most are communication and trust. I will be talking about communication in a little bit, but communication is probably one of the areas within this partnership that is the most likely to be operationally defined in terms of what does communication look like, what do we know meaningful communication looks like, sounds like, should be like between a family and professional. But trust is very ambiguous. We use the word trust repeatedly in research and in practical journals that are about family professional partnerships, yet we never really define that word in actionable terms, or so that we can replicate it or repeat what we're doing. We know trust is important when it's gone, but we do not know really how we define it, build it, develop it, nurture it, and repair it when it is gone. So again, going back to the behavior analyst in me, this is where I wanted to really dig into what is trust, what does it look like, what does trusting behaviors look like for teachers and families, how can we provide that information so that we can emulate that in our interactions. So we know that there is an extreme level of an expectation of trust between parents and educators. There is trust in many cases throughout education. If we really stop to think about it, we assume trust happens. If it doesn't, it's maybe because there's some deliberate behaviors or actions that didn't take place, but we don't necessarily know what those are. So let's think about how often we really see or fall on the concept of trust in education. We know that there's an expectation that teachers will trust parents, that parents will trust teachers, that students will trust their teachers, that teachers can trust their leaders and their colleagues, their administrators, the community will trust the school and vice versa. Trust is required in many instances in order for change to take place. Trust is a critical factor as we consider school improvement and effectiveness. In fact, in all levels of any organization, trust is found to facilitate productivity. And we know that in its absence of trust, it impedes progress. Without trust, a student's energy is diverted oftentimes towards self-protection and away from learning. And that goes the same way when it comes to conflict between educators and families. When trust is not there, we tend to go within, retreat within for self-protection, and we remove ourselves from the opportunity which we want, which is to resolve that issue. Trust is also everywhere in our lives, right? When we go to the grocery store and we buy food, we are trusting that the food that we are buying is healthy, is what they say it's going to be. The ingredients are in there. When we eat at a restaurant, we're trusting that the chefs have used all the appropriate procedures and measures to cook it appropriately. When we cross bridges, we are trusting that the engineers have done their work and that bridge is going to hold us up as we cross over that. When we work on our computers or we do webinars like right now, we trust in the technology and we trust in the internet that it's going to be able to hold us through and get us through the rest of the presentation. When we work with our doctors or any other professionals, we put our health in their hands and we trust them with that. That lower picture is for those of you who might have had the opportunity to teach a teen driver how to trust. Or teach a teen driver while you're hopefully trusting that your life is going to be okay. There is trust in everything we do. And it's something that we don't necessarily take the chance to look at. So we're going to dive deeper into trust. So when we do learn to develop and nurture trust, what happens? So where, when, and how do we actually learn exhibit behaviors to build trust? So the question is, when have you learned trust? Have you been, think about your own selves, if a little self-reflection briefly is, there's a lot of trust. I'd like to encourage you all to sort of internally self-reflect right now in terms of who do you feel that you need to trust in your life in order to be productive. So, and this, by the way, is about trust between families and professional partnerships, but this is also trust in everything. And we know that trust is different with different relationships. So thinking about in your own work, what type of trust is required and when have you maybe learned to develop that trust? There's often these skill sets that we refer to as soft skills, where they're not necessarily discreetly taught, but they're ones that we learn by observation, through practice, through reinforcement, and trust is one of those soft skills, so to speak. Whereas I'm guessing most of us haven't taken a class in college or learned directly a lesson in school on how to trust someone, but yet we are expected to trust in ways. So we know that trust is important and it's mentioned throughout family professional partnership, but do we actually take the time to teach our pre-service teachers how to trust? Because there's a lot of expectations that we're putting on our teachers as well as families when it comes to trust. So research tells us that we're not doing very well right now when it comes to teaching those soft skills, or what I would like to say relationship skills. that are really important for developing that partnership. We're not doing a good job of teaching our teachers those skills before they go out in the field. We do a pretty good job, for the most part, research is showing, in addressing academics and teaching teachers how to use specific literacy strategies, for example, behavior analytics strategies, et cetera. But how much do we really teach our educators on how to build trust, how to operationally move through an IEP meeting so that we know that all participants are feeling like they have a voice, a seat at the table, and that there is that active participation that we know is intended through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So in a study of 113 special education faculty members across 52 research institutions that were specifically focused on pre-service preparation for special education teachers, results indicated that there is a disconnect in the value and implementation of what we call family professional partnership related knowledge and skills at the program and faculty levels. So there's patterns of inconsistent family professional partnership coverage across graduate and undergraduate programmings. And this is a problem. So in a large study with myself and a few colleagues, we asked professors across the universities, across the country who train teachers, how well are you preparing teachers to work with families? And the answer is not well. So hopefully today's will give you a little bit of an idea of how you can, in turn, take some of this knowledge and practice and provide it with some of those educators who might need a little bit more, because we're essentially asking a lot of our educators and families without really formally preparing them with what those expectations are. So this is one of my favorite quotes by Bayer, who is one of the original philosophers, who asked, when do we really take the time to notice trust? So he says, we notice trust as we notice air, only when it becomes scarce or polluted. And in many cases, I can say that that is true for the research I've done with families and professionals in conflict. Trust comes up when it's broken. You don't hear it as much as it's building. It's more when it's feeling broken. That's when we tend to notice it more. So questioning to all of us in our own fields and our positions is, when do we teach trust? When do we notice trust? Do we reinforce it? Are we challenging it? Are we expecting trust, or are we demanding trust? Likewise, do we celebrate trust when it is present in the family professional partnership? Or do we wait until there's a conflict to occur and then we realize, oh gosh, trust is broken. Maybe we should have looked into this a little bit further. In other words, how much attention are all of us really providing trust? As we learn about trust today, I want you to please keep in mind the notion of building, nurturing, and repairing the life cycle of trust. So it's not a once it's there, it's gone necessarily. There's enough research to show that we can rebuild, repair trust. But in order to do that, we really need to know what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like in that family professional partnership. So much like conflict prevention and resolution, also want to emphasize that trust requires vulnerability and effort. So trust has only recently begun to be truly examined. And that started in the 1950s and 1960s with philosophers. There's various definitions of trust, and many of those definitions are based on the degree of that relationship. So for example, there's two pictures that you see right now. The one in the bottom right corner is what we call a linchpin. And if you see that little pin that is basically holding that wheel on the spoke of some kind of vehicle, it looks like an old wagon. And trust is described as the linchpin of a relationship. In other words, it's holding it all together. If someone were to pull that pin right out of that wheel, the entire wagon would fall down. There would be no stability. In the top left corner, there's a picture of two people clearly trusting each other. One, or maybe not, she might have some trepidation, or they might have trepidation on their face, but rock climbing, reaching towards someone to pull them up. There is a level of interdependence that is required. So although trust is difficult to define because we know there's so many different viewpoints, we know it's incredibly important. So what we know about trust in the research that's been done, and as I've said, much of that began with philosophers looking at trust. We know that trust is necessary for effective cooperation and communication, the foundations for essentially a cohesive and productive relationship in any organization. If you are a parent, I would like you to close your eyes and think of a time that you had a trusting relationship with an educator for your child. If you're an educator, I want you to close your eyes and think of a time that you had a trusting relationship with a parent or one of your students. If neither of these roles speaks to you, please think of a trusting relationship that you have with another colleague or a peer. And just for a moment, reflect on that trust. What does a trusting relationship look like? What characteristics or actions have taken place between you and the other party or parties that are indicative of trust? What are the things and actions? What are the words, actions that are being done that are demonstrating trust with you? And what does it really mean to you to trust? So just take a couple of moments to think about that. And then I'd like to emphasize, and this is something you can do later on. I don't want to take away the time of our thoughts, but please do think about these as we move forward in your work, and think about trust. And when you find yourself in a situation where you're feeling mistrust, stop and really reflect on what are the actions that are showing you that there's mistrust? What are actions that have shown you that there is trust in the past, and how can we move forward from that? So we know that it requires interdependence, meaning this is not something on your own, although there is some trust you need to have with yourself, but that's a different topic altogether. Today, we're talking about trust between parties. We know that the degrees of trust are based on that relationship. In other words, your degree of trust is going to look different with a partner for life versus a colleague or somebody that you might be driving next to on the road. There's a form of trust that you have with the drivers that are next to you as well, or a driver that's in front of you. You're trusting they're going to stop and slow down at the appropriate time. But that level of trust is obviously very different than the kind of trust you would want between a family and a professional, or even in a relationship or a partnership somebody might have. We also know that trust is multifaceted. There's many different involvement, moving dynamic pieces to trust. There's moral and ethical issues. That's a philosophical perspective of trust. And then also from an economic perspective of trust, there's a cost benefit calculation that takes place when people are looking at trust in an economic way. Regardless, you're going to hear the word vulnerability a lot from me today. Trust requires varying degrees of comfort and vulnerability. And that includes when we're at an IEP meeting and we're faced with maybe sharing some information as a parent of a child with a disability. Maybe I'm sharing some very personal information about my family and my child that I feel is valuable to that professional team to know about my child and their circumstances. But it requires me to be vulnerable and showing a side of me that I might not necessarily feel comfortable sharing. There's a lot of expectations we have when it comes to that partnership. And that is one of them, the vulnerability. So we also know that, I should say, that trust has been found to have a direct impact on student achievement. The greater that faculty can trust in students and their parents, the higher level of school achievement in reading and math. There's research that shows this, which is really interesting. Even after controlling for socioeconomic status, when faculty or school staff are able to show trust, there is a significant relationship between reading and math achievement in students. So we know that trust is repeatedly identified in research in the family professional partnership, as I've described earlier. But we also know now that trust can both escalate and de-escalate conflict. Optimal trust is defined by Aristotle as the golden mean, which is between excess and deficiency. So because trust is an integral component of the family professionals partnership, it has that ability to prevent conflict, knowing that if I have a trusting relationship between a teacher, if I, as a parent, I have a trusting relationship, I feel that I have a trusting relationship with a professional, then when issues come up, for example, let's say my student has a behavioral issue that happens in the day, and the professional notifies me about what happened with the student and how the teacher handled it. When there's trust that's involved between me and that teacher, there's more likely to be an acceptance and an understanding of that situation that occurred and a conversation about it, rather than when there's mistrust, I might be automatically coming to the conversation thinking, what happened to my child? What was done to my child? What did this educator do to escalate my child, or what have you? All different conversations may happen in our head when there's not that level of trust. So in a 2004 study that was conducted by Blue Banning and colleagues, this is a pretty pivotal study in the family professional partnership literature of special education. There were 33 focus groups that were conducted with over 137 adult family members of children both with and without disabilities, as well as 53 school providers and administrators, including following up with 32 individual interviews with non-English speaking families and their service providers to explore the quality indicators of professional behaviors that the participants identified as necessary for developing a partnership between the family and the school. Based on their own experiences, finding those from this study identified that indicators of professional behavior that facilitated that partnership included communication, commitment, equality, skills, respect, and trust. And if you'll notice, communication is something that's a little easier to identify what it looks like and sounds like, commitment as well, equality, skills, respect can be a little bit more vague. So we're going to put some definition to that today, as well as trust. And one really important quote that I really like that's been completed by the Turnbull and colleagues is that trusting family professional partnerships are characterized by an alliance in which families and professionals confidently build on each other's word, judgment, and wise actions to increase educational benefits for students and themselves. In the field of family professional partnerships, we're growing and working towards having more observable and measurable behaviors and specifically actions that educators can exhibit to be good partners with families, and likewise families with educators. We've heard things like collaboration, cooperation, meaningful partnerships, etc. And as I've said before, much of my work on conflict always includes that word trust. So if we use the word trust as a way to promote that ultimate partnership, what does that look like? So now let's look into defining trust in a much more concrete way. Trust is recognized as both complex and, as I said earlier, multidimensional. It's also, as I said, non-linear. It's circular. So, we can go in and out of trust in different ways in different relationships, but we know that there's three major components. There's cognitive, there's the affective, and there's the behavioral component. So the cognitive aspect, if you will, the little images are to give you a little bit of a guideline, are thinking with your head. So the cognitive aspects of trust affect our thinking, our reasoning, and our overall sense of judgment about a person or a partnership. As partners, families and professionals are likely to have a multitude of thoughts, perceptions, and beliefs that are associated with the other person or persons in that partnership. So as I said, this is described as thinking with your head. So the cognitive aspects of forming and maintaining a partnership with trust with your partner, for example, someone you're consulting with, etc., refers to thoughts that may develop about a person or a situation and how those thoughts may complement or in some ways collide with that person's values, beliefs, and experiences. So further, because partnerships are interdependent, and we know that requires collaborative behaviors, talking, problem solving, working together, etc., the cognitive aspects of trust require that partners think through situations and make decisions accordingly. Cognitive processes like this essentially affect whether or not we trust somebody. And if so, what our confidence level in that trusted situation or person looks like. And I want you to really think about that affective component or the cognitive thinking with your head. And when I talked about similar characteristics, etc. So this is where we know that when people are aligned with people who have similar characteristics, similar backgrounds, similar experiences, we tend to trust them more. Why? Because we feel, first of all, that there's a sense of common humanity amongst us, that there's some commonalities, and some, hopefully, because of that, there's this perception that there's shared beliefs, that there's shared expectations, and that there's shared experiences. And so it makes sense that we're more likely to trust someone who we think is more like us. We think they think more like us. We think they act more like us. This is why we know one of the supportive components of partnering families with other family members. We know that when we partner in, for example, parent-to-parent research, there's a lot of research that shows that partnering families with other families and families of children with disabilities, in some cases, I'm partnering parents of children with autism with other parents of children with autism if it needs to be disability specific, or it might be specifically toward a language speaking group or a group that's from a particular region, et cetera. But when there's the shared commonality cognitively, we're able to make that association with trust more easily. Now, what does that mean for us as we're wanting to build trust? This is a way that we can hopefully try to find a common ground. When we find common grounds and we relate to one another, and any of us know with our people skills and conflict resolution skills that when we're able to find that relationship with one another, that there's a commonality or there's a shared experience, a shared belief, a shared expectation, we're more likely to get them on that same level playing field, hopefully, where we can work to build that trust. The affective domain of trust is, if you will, thinking with your heart. So trust elicits a number of feelings and emotions that can either promote a meaningful partnership or it can build barriers between families and professionals. So the affective component of trust is often referred to as I said, thinking with your head, which means those feelings that promote trust between families and professionals include things like benevolence and confidence, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, that professionals will act in the best interest of the student. This trust also includes a sense of assurance about the reliability or dependability of the character. Emotions have the ability to both build and or break levels of trust. So with cognitive, we're thinking with our head, we're logically trying to find associations between parties and logically thinking, can I trust this individual? But affectively, my heart is thinking, is this the kind of person that I feel comfortable with, that I can be vulnerable with? Is there benevolence? Is there kindness? Do I feel like there's a mutual benefit here involved? And that is the affective domain of trust. And then finally, the behavioral domain, I've alluded to a little bit already, are some of those interactions and actual actions that make up the behavioral dimension of trust. So in essence, all behavior that's observed is considered when developing a trusting partnership with relationships. So in a trusting relationship, such as listening to families, exhibiting a caring commitment to families, following through with expectations or agreements that have been provided to the family, or or an opportunity has been available to that family. Other behavioral actions are things like simply keeping your word and being reliable and following through with what you said you would do. So the behavioral dimension of trust is those actual actions, the follow through, the behaviors that we're seeing exhibited to demonstrate that there is trust that can take place between the party. And then likewise, I'm talking about building trust cognitively, affectively, and behaviorally right now, but I'd like you to also know that this also goes, as I said, this builds trust and it also can break down trust. So there's also cognitive, affective, and behavioral levels that can reduce that level of trust. So if cognitively I don't see shared, I'm seeing a discrepancy between my expectation and the school team's expectation, or likewise as a parent or a teacher, whichever role you want to be in, again, interchangeably. If I'm cognitively seeing some challenges with that trust, or if I'm emotionally feeling those challenges, or if I'm behaviorally seeing actions that are showing me that I cannot trust this person, then we have those three domains can also break down that trust. There are 5 facets of trust. So this is the part where the behavior analyst in me gets really excited, because this is the science of trust. This is the part where researchers have done the work. And I should say the research that I'm talking about, these 5 facets of trust, come specifically out of trust in education research. So Shannon Moran and Hoy are some pretty prolific researchers that look at school-based trust, including administrator trust, school-wide trust between families and professionals, and the family professional trust dynamic that I'm speaking about today. And within those 5 facets, again, there's that word vulnerable. There's a willingness to be vulnerable to another party based on the confidence that the latter party is benevolent, reliable, competent, honest, and open. So this view of trust also draws from sociology, economics, and organizational science. What I want to emphasize is that trust is not a feeling of warmth or affection, but a conscious regulation of one's dependence on another. There are crucial thresholds across which trust turns to distrust. However, those different facets of trust may have different thresholds depending on the level of reliance in that area and those consequences of one's expectations not being met. When it comes to conflict, one of my favorite definitions is by Folger and Poole, and that is, it is the interference of combat. It's a compatibility where there is an interference where our expectations are different from one another. So in other words, a lot of times people think that conflict is just they go straight to the emotions, the argument or something to that effect. But really all conflict is, according to Folger and Poole, is the inability to have the same perspectives. We're having different perspectives with one another. And it's having those 2 different perspectives that are incompatible. The key word with Folger and Poole is incompatible goals and expectations with one another. So when educators and family members come together and conflict happens, this is because there's an incompatible goal or an expectation amongst both parties. And so by looking at the 5 facets of trust and using these, we can hopefully break down what those incompatible goals and expectations are. Incompatible, not conflicting, incompatible. So they're not aligned with one another. And that makes sense, right? Families have different expectations of educators. Educators have different expectations of families. And educators and families are likely to come to the IEP meeting or whatever educational meetings that may exist, fill in the blank, and they are likely to have incompatible goals and expectations. That doesn't mean they cannot work through and build trust. It's being able to identify what those incompatible goals and expectations are, and then work with the 5 facets of trust to address those. So another thing that's been suggested is that if a person's actions and intentions are perceived as benevolent, then he or she can be trusted even if his or her credibility is less than perfect. That's been shown in some research. So even when on record, someone might not necessarily seem like they're credible. If they're benevolent, kind, it goes a very, very long way. Some books that might be supportive, if you want to know more, is Shannon Moran. One book is called Trust Matters, Leadership for Successful Schools. And there's some other research that has been produced by them that can be helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and break down each of these 5 facets. And first, we're going to talk about benevolence. Benevolence refers to, first and foremost, as kindness and the goodwill of the interdependence within a relationship. The very act of benevolence conveys a message of general care for the other person with the expectation that protection and no harm will take place. Perhaps the most common facet of trust is a sense of benevolence, because the confidence that one's well-being or that someone or somebody cares about will be protected and not harmed by the trusted party goes very far. Families rely on the goodwill of professionals who care for their child every day. And that is, there's an expectation that the family is vulnerable and will not be exploited or worsened. Their child will be assisted and supported, and that relationship will be cared for and addressed in a meaningful and kind-hearted way. Because the nature of family professional partnerships because of the nature of family relationships with professionals is so unique, which it is. It's based on the diversity of family needs. Benevolence refers to professionals taking account of the family and the child's needs, and consequently acting in the best interest of that family. A benevolent educator is someone a family knows is kind and looks out for their goodwill. A benevolent family member is somebody educators know is kind and supportive of their role as the educator for that child. So benevolence is that interdependence within that relationship when it comes to it. And it's very simple. Benevolence is being kind and expressing care and goodwill. And again, going back to that place of vulnerability, knowing that my welfare will be taken care of and that I can trust that this person is going to take care of me in whatever way that looks like and support me in whatever way that looks like. Reliability. So the second facet of trust is being reliable. And in many ways, trust has to do with predictability. That is the consistency of behavior and knowing what we can and cannot expect from others. So when a partner keeps their word and follows through with what they say they will do, emphasis on with benevolence, then they are reliable. Reliability occurs when a partner keeps that word, and predictability is unsatisfying as a definition of trust. When we trust a person, if we trust a person, for example, you can't just say that predictability means you're reliable. It needs to be a different types of predictability, a benevolent predictability. So for example, I might know that an educator is reliably late to a meeting. That does not necessarily mean that there's trust that's being built. So that's where the with benevolence comes into play. It's reliability with benevolence. So they're reliably supporting me. They're reliably following through with the actions they've said. They're reliably communicating with me in the ways that they've said that they would do. They're reliably sharing information in the way that they did. I remember one time I was doing a family training, supporting families on how to partner with educators. And we were talking specifically about communication. And trust came up, and the teacher and the parent said that I knew I could trust the teacher and that they were a reliable source when they followed through with the communication that I requested. She said that she had a child with some pretty significant behavior and communication, and that student also did very well academically. And years in the past, this parent was repeatedly provided communication, daily communication that was specific to what the child learned that day, academics. And this parent said, I've repeatedly asked these different educators, it's important for me to know about their academics, but it's really important for me to know if my child sat with somebody at lunch today. And this parent said, when I found a teacher who took the time to send me an email and share with me, hey, I just wanted you to know, I just walked into the lunchroom. I saw your son. He was sitting with 3 different children, and this is what was happening. I knew this teacher was reliable. This teacher followed through with what I was asking, and I felt heard. And that was an example of that trust and that reliability that was followed through. So it is important that there's some benevolence that is associated with that level of reliability. Competence. Competence comes up a lot, as it should. As a parent, I want to know that the educators that are working with my child are competent and that they're able to follow through with the work that's being asked, that they have the experience, that they have the knowledge, that they have the skills, the behavior, they're able to exhibit the performance and goals that are associated with what we're asking. There are times when good intentions are not enough. And in many cases, when it comes to addressing the needs of a student who is on an IEP, good intentions are not enough. We need to have a level of competency. When a person is dependent on another, but some level of skill is involved in fulfilling that expectation, an individual who means well, but is not competent may not be trusted. Institution-based trust is supported by both formal social structures that confer trust, such as having a license or a certification to practice a profession, or some type of mechanism that guarantees insurance or contracts. So when we have institution-based trust, we have institution-based trust through our licensure standards. For example, when you have a licensed teacher, there is a level of competence that is acknowledged because they hold this licensure that is required to address this need. So having that competence means that parents expect you to know the content and consequently develop and follow through with expectations for their child by taking action and seeking to gain the necessary knowledge and skills that is needed. So although not all educators may know exactly all of the interventions, or for example, let's say you're working with a student who has some behavior challenges, and I use those examples because that's my field, but fill in the blank, it could be academic, etc. If there is a remedy or an intervention that is being proposed and the professional is not necessarily competent or trained in that, there is a level of trust that comes with acknowledging I do not have experience or training in this, but I am willing to learn more about it and go the extra mile to learn more about this. That helps develop more of that competence. So I want you to hear that you don't necessarily have to have all of the competence going in. There's also, in addition to having the competence already as a foundation, there's that knowledge and that skill set, that mindset that I'm willing to learn more if I need to, so I can be competent and address the student's needs in whatever way that may be. And it is important that I think to acknowledge that parents are sometimes better able to trust professionals' actions when they know that professionals know what they're doing. It's very simple, right? If I know that an intervention is being proposed to me for a child and that there is a level of competence in the person that's following it through, I'm more likely to trust that and go forward with it. And then it's also important to note that for some families, either because there's this inherent value or in some cases, there's a cultural disposition, there is in some cases an automatic level of confidence in a professional's level of competence. So you see that in some culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse groups where there is a level of competence and trust in that educator's competence because of that institutional-based trust that we talked about. And it's important that when that is present, we don't take advantage of that and that we still work within our own realm of competence. And if we are not competent, that we acknowledge that and move forward with that. In other words, just because we have the title as an educator doesn't mean we know everything. Just because I have a PhD in special education does not mean that I have the expertise in all of the areas that are existent. There are times when I need to be vulnerable and own up to, this is something I don't know about, but I'm willing to learn more about it. And there are many families that need to know and want to know the proper training and practice. So one of the things I always recommend whenever I do IEP trainings and I talk with educators is if a family member comes to you at an IEP meeting or any meeting and says, hey, what do you know about this strategy or this intervention? What are your thoughts about it? If you know about it, then feel free to share and talk about it. But if you don't, by all means, you don't need to fake it to show that you're competent. You can show that you're competent by acknowledging the knowledge you have and being willing to scaffold new knowledge into that. I've seen a lot of errors happen when educators try to fake something or go along with something. And then sometimes that can kind of be a backlash, because sometimes the proposed intervention or strategy that might be shared with everyone might not be research-based. It could have been found out on 2020 or hard copy, and that does not mean that that's the end all be all of research. So competence has, if you will, a bit of a continuum when it comes to being competent in what you know and being able to learn more to be competent in what you don't know. Honesty is one that is, I think, often overlooked, and it is a key facet that is to be considered when it comes to trust. It has been said that one must be able to rely on the word and action of another in order to trust the other. And trust, we know, is defined by philosophers as the expectation that the promised word, verbal, or written statement of another person or individual can be relied upon. Honesty considers a person's authenticity. Being honest with families, even when having to share challenging information, opens the opportunity for trust to develop. By contrast, dishonesty will likely close that door to any hope of a trusting partnership. Parents want to know that they will receive accurate and honest information, and educators likewise want to know that they will also receive accurate and honest information from families. Being open. Being open is, in a trusting relationship, refers to being vulnerable, there's that word again, and sharing information rather than withholding. Likewise, openness refers to a professional's ability to be flexible in thinking and to consider all aspects of a given situation for all parties involved. Being open is a key component that we see in mediation, we see in resolution sessions, and we see in facilitated IEPs, because this is when we're really bringing everyone together. And openness also, I should say, also not those formal ones, but even just traditional IEP meetings or any kind of meeting in general. But we know that if you're wanting to make some change and there's disagreements or challenges or incompatibility, again, going that definition of conflict, if there's incompatible goals and expectations, when we are open, we are hopefully keeping our minds and hearts, cognitive, affective, behaviorally, and our actions open to sharing information, hearing information, entertaining information, and being flexible with coming up with potential solutions to address whatever challenging situation may have come up. And openness also, that's in a repairing of trust kind of situation, but in a building trust kind of situation, when someone is open and vulnerable and shares information, we are more likely to in kind also do the same. And that helps build some of that relationship that we want to see. So in a partnership, it is important to be open to another's opinions, ideas, and feedback, especially when we're working through decisions for a student. Openness is a valuable approach to use when problem solving as an educational team, including, as I said, taking the time to listen to parent concerns and ideas about addressing student needs. And in some cases, sharing information that may be hard for the family to hear. And that was mentioned in honesty as well. And I want to really be mindful of that. There are many instances where I've been involved as a facilitator of an IEP And the family has said, I know they're not being honest and open with me about the child's behavior. And I've been in meetings where I know that a child has been extremely aggressive and the educators are saying, well, he doesn't really get along with his peers. That's not true. He's hurting his peers. We need to be open and honest and address the situation so we can learn to problem solve and be able to address that. So sometimes that is saying the hard and challenging things that need to be said. So let's talk about this disposition of trust now that we just went over those 5 facets. People with a trustworthy disposition tend to be more trustworthy than others, even when they can increase their gain by being trustworthy. So there are some people that are naturally more trusting than others. Dispositions may be based on previous experiences, related experiences, etc. Some people have a tendency to extend trust more readily to people they perceive as similar to themselves, as I talked about with that cognitive level of awareness of shared experiences and perceptions and maybe expectations. Zucker, 1986, he called that character-based trust, which is trust judgments that are based on a similarity or a group membership that can have real consequences for partnering with families. So that's positive and negative. It can go both ways if we have that level of trust judgments that we're making on others. Moods and emotions are involved when it comes to the dispositions of trust. High trusters seem to be happier and have stronger friendships, interestingly. And although several studies have shown that there is a correlation between trust and liking someone, especially when the dimension of benevolence has been associated, affection does not necessarily need to be present for trust to develop. So that doesn't mean you have to go above and beyond and be the kind of person, if you're not a overtly warm, caring disposition kind of person in that respect, that form of affection does not necessarily need to be present for that trust. Rather, it's having that benevolence and all of those other facets involved. Disposition to trust does not mean that people will be more gullible or exhibit what Deutsch referred to as pathological trust, regardless of their trusting disposition. People are able to make use of available information to guide those actions in a given situation. So I would encourage you to reflect on yourself briefly and think about yourself. Are you one of those people that tends to be more trusting than somebody else? And when you work with others, remember that there are some that are naturally more trusting, and there are others that are less trusting and a little bit more reserved. And I think it's worth sharing that in my experience with family professional partnership research, especially with conflict, there is a level there's the disposition of trust can get broken down from previous breakdowns in communication and relationships. So in other words, it's not uncommon for a family member of, let's say, if have a parent of a child who's a high schooler with a disability, who maybe as a parent, you've gone through the child's in 10th grade, you've got 10 grades worth of relationships with educators that may or may not have been beneficial or trustworthy. When you come to the table at that year 10 with that child, that parent's level and disposition of trust has been impacted and affected by their years of experience. Families do not forget what they've been through, and so neither do teachers, and it goes both ways. Same with teachers. You may have a disposition of trust that's changed as a result of your learned experiences. So it's really important to keep that in mind. If we have a family member that has a high schooler and we're wondering, why are we getting so much conflict right off the bat? Why do I feel like this parent came to the IEP meeting angry at me and I've never even met them? And I'm not saying that's the case with all families. Please hear that out. But in many cases, that does happen sometimes, or a teacher might come upset to a leadership team meeting. And that is often because there's been burned paths in the process, that up until that point, there's been some challenges, there's some difficulties. And if that's happened with you, with anyone in any relationship, you know that it takes time to repair. So let's talk about that. What happens when that trust is broken? Just as trust breeds trust, so does distrust. Distrust also breeds distrust. So what happens when our experience, or we have a shift of experience in our expectations of that partnership? Like most behavior changes, we increase the variety of our behaviors and the duration of our behaviors. So what I want to say here is, when we feel that we have been harmed, hurt, or we're being mistrusted, or we feel that we don't have trust, you're going to see, going back to what I said early on when I started this, there's a lot more self-preservation that takes place. A lot of people retreat out of the relationship and they go into themselves. It's about protecting themselves. It's about accepting what's going on, addressing what's going on. And in many cases, this is when we find families might start reaching out to other people to come to the meetings. We might have different organizations, different representations, different roles that come to the table that we're bringing along with it. In some instances, families and educators might resort to drastic measures that might be things like unhealthy communication. It could be withholding information. It could be withdrawal of information. People often go to those levels of extreme because of that self-protection and or a fierce level of advocacy on the behalf of their child or themselves if they feel like they're not being supported or they're being wronged. Or was trust ever there to begin with? Did it break, or did it not really have a strong foundation to begin with? We know that there are barriers to developing and nurturing trust between families and professionals. We have years, over 40 years of history and research that shows the work and effort families have and continue to demonstrate to advocate for their students. Unfortunately, this work comes at many cases with a cost. Years of little to no trust or broken trust. There is fears of the educators and the system. There might be betrayal from previous educators that families might have experienced. There might be past experiences or a background with advocating for their child that they're keeping at the back of their mind while they're trying to move forward with the future. There could be a power imbalance in numbers and actual card holding, which we know exists naturally. There is an inequity in the way that IEP meetings are set up, in the sense that typically there's, at least 3 times or 2 times the amount of educators to family members. And that does naturally create about power imbalance, as well as an inequity in terms of the competence, the level, the experience and knowledge, the skills, the legal background, the educational records, all of those cards that the schools hold. That is a feeling of imbalance that many families report in our research. And I should add, the barriers to developing and nurturing trust that I'm describing now are all well cited throughout research. As I've said, beginning in the inception of IDEA, we've started noting these types of challenges and barriers to nurturing trust. There's also, going back to talking about inaccurate or false knowledge or information that might be available about that child or about the situation. There might be significant differences in values and attitudes. Going back to Folger and Poole's definition of conflict I shared of incompatible goals and expectations. This is an example of that. Going back to that, there might be systemic or procedural obstacles that might be experienced. There could be environmental barriers, like, for example, where a family lives, the school issues, access, military families, etc. And a lot of times I do want to add that there could be what we call a sort of a value glasses imbalance, whereas the attitudes that are maybe different in an expectation, we see when we're working with families that are different than what we traditionally would see. So we've got a lot of changing demographics of families. We have teenage parents. We have grandparents, we have linguistically and economically diverse families. All of these different families, there's a different intersectionality and many different components that need to be considered when working with these families. It's not a catch-all be-all necessarily. I should say, by the way, that all of can be flipped to build trust. So we can take these barriers and we can flip them. How can we eliminate fear? How can we eliminate betrayal? What can we do about those past experiences and background, et cetera? When it comes to trust and conflict, we know that there, as I said, trust comes up a lot in the conflict research. So this is a quote: "In the absence of trust, people are increasingly unwilling to take risks, demand greater protections against the possibility of betrayal, and increasingly insist on costly sanctioning mechanisms to defend their interests." This is when we see families and educators going to due process in situations that could potentially be remedied outside of the courthouse, outside of a dispute resolution officer, in mediation, in a facilitation, et cetera. But because trust has been broken and conflict is present, we see less of an opportunity for families and educators to feel comfortable to take those risks, to build those partnerships. In the research that I've done of looking at common sources of dispute in special education, we know that the major reasons are design of services. That might be examples like eligibility or IEP goals in relation to a student's needs. It could be the delivery of services, and that could be IEP goal follow through, placement, educational practices, et cetera. Obviously, you're not going to go to due process for relationship issues. You're going to go there because FAPE has been challenged in some way, shape, or form. However, what the research shows us that many of those issues are clouded by relationship issues. They're affected by a breakdown of communication, trust, power imbalance, lack of administrator availability, lack of parent valuation. In other words, lack of valuing the parent as a contributing and equal partner in that family professional partnership. Discrepant views of the child, so talking about rather than strengths-based, focusing more on deficits or challenges of what the child can't do versus what the child can do. And I know that when we have IEP meetings, we are supposed to address some of those challenges, but it's also important that we don't just focus on that. It's important we use strength-based perspectives as well, so we can use those strengths to increase the things that we want to see increase academically, behaviorally, or socially in those students. And then, of course, knowledge. A lack of knowledge and skills is another reason why we see families and professionals going to due process. So it could be special education law, lack of knowledge, follow through with the law, lack of educational or behavioral practices, lack of resolution practices for conflicts, et cetera. And then finally, constraints, resource restrictions, those different areas that get in the way, tend to get in the way. So distrust is the confident expectation that another's motives, intentions, and behaviors are sinister and harmful to one's own interests. In interdependent relationships, this often entails a sense of fear and association of discomfort or danger. Distrust naturally prompts us to take steps that reduce our vulnerability in an attempt to protect our interests. That's that self-protection I was talking about. Accordingly, our distrust often of others is likely to evoke a competitive as opposed to that cooperative orientation that stimulates and exacerbates conflict. So what I like to say in situations like this is, it doesn't matter how well you know behavior or academics, or how well you're able to describe a student's IEP goals, and how much you say, I'm here for the best interest of this child. You may feel that way as an educator. You may be saying that strongly, but if there's no trust, that is not going to be heard, seen, valued, or understood. And all of those skills go to the wayside. So this is coming back to, we have to have a really nurture. We talk about a family professional partnership or relationship, just like any relationship that needs to exist. There's some form of work that takes place to keep that relationship going. And unfortunately, in many cases, the relationship between families and educators doesn't get nurtured very often. And it's usually a one-time, I see you at the IEP meeting once a year, or maybe we do a little check-in, but it's not the ongoing nurturing that needs to take place in order to have that trusting relationship. And don't hear me that this is this long time consuming thing that you need to be everybody's best friend. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about the benevolence, being open, being honest, competent, and so forth. We know that a great amount of trust has broken as a result of the pandemic. And so I just want to put this out here to acknowledge that there is a lot of trust that's being broken throughout everybody in our society with the pandemic. And so I could not, talk about trust and this relationship without acknowledging the many implications we've experienced as a result of the pandemic. We know that services have been halted, expectations have been put on families that didn't exist in the past and with teachers. And as a result, everybody's feeling really burnt, exhausted, overwhelmed, and we're naturally taking things out on each other. And the benevolence is not as present as it has been in the past. And so just keeping that in mind as we move forward. So let's talk about those strategies to develop and nurture trust. And I know we're coming up on the time to start addressing some of those questions. So I'm going to get into these strategies. This is a sunshine model that I'd like to put forward for you to look at. This is something my colleagues and I published in our Family Professional Partnership textbook. So it's used more for training, not like a casual read you're going to want, but just wanted to emphasize that within this framework, we've got respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. These are the skill sets, these are the dispositions that we want to see, the behaviors, if you will, that we see in a trusting family professional partnership. The rays of the sunshine model are all of the activities where we are able to demonstrate these different behaviors that are associated with trust. So during behavior examples, student assessment, special meetings, student transitions, academic learning, school capacity enhancement, through all of these major activities that involve trusting partnerships, you can exemplify respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. Respect is the first one that I'm going to talk about. And Shannon Moran, who, as I talked about, were the ones who defined the 5 facets of trust, the researchers, they described respect as akin to benevolence. So respect is very much like benevolence. So it's practicing benevolence through due regard for the feelings, wishes, rights, or traditions of others. So now let's talk about those observable and measurable behaviors. What does respect look like in a trusting family professional partnership? Respect is being prepared to meet with the family. It's attending meetings with families on time and families attending on time as well. All of these go back and forth. So if I say with families, just flip it with teachers or educators as well. It's developing relationships with one another. It's communicating between the families and the professionals on an ongoing basis. It's treating the family or educator with esteem, the benevolence. Other considerations for respect, adherence to boundaries. If an educator says that they would only like to communicate via email, or a parent says the same, then let's respect that boundary. It's balancing those power dynamics that I talked about that can exist. It's paying attention to families. It's being empathetic. It's honoring family culture and reflecting on our own cultural lens to see and be sure that we are being culturally responsive. And it's celebrating strengths of the family as well as the child, as well as the team. And it's seeking to understanding the values of others involved. Equity. Oh, I should also add other components of respect, being open-minded. That's important, going back to that openness, acknowledging each other's expertise as well. Equity is enhancing the fairness and the equality of opportunity and dignity. And we know that in a lot of the research with family professional partnership, equity is challenged because of the power dynamics that we see just in the way that IDEA was set up in the IEP meetings and all the structures and everything. It's inequitable in many ways in the way the system is put up, but there are some specific things we can do to address these disparities. And that is looking through the 6 types of capital that can exist. And capital helps to build and address equity. So capital is providing parents the opportunity to communicate with each other, connecting parents with each other so they have social capital. That is why we see a lot of family members benefit from bringing somebody else to the IEP table with them. That is developing a sense of social capital so that they're able to have some social supports that's helping to bring that equity to the table. Navigational capital is learning your way through the system. So for example, helping families learn to understand and address the different dynamics, that understand what their expectations are at IEP meetings, how they can participate, etc. Linguistic capital is the language, including understanding special education language. Familial capital is including families or having other components that might be supportive of the family. Resistance capital, that includes activism, family groups, looking further into idea and understanding it. And finally, aspirational capital. And this is one that I think we need to really work on a lot in our field, is not assuming negative associations or outcomes because of discrepant views of the child. So we don't want to judge parent expectations. We shouldn't judge expectations. It's important to have aspirational capital so that we're optimistic and positive about outcomes and what that can look like. Communication, first and foremost, being honest and open. Communication is a lot easier to break down of what that looks like. So the things that I'm going to focus on the most is a few things. First, when a high degree of trust allows for open exchange of information, problems are usually disclosed, diagnosed, and they can be corrected before they're compounded or challenged even further. We know that principals or administrators can foster the flow of information through being open and honest in their communication with educators. That's something that we're seeing in administrative and school leadership research about trust. But most importantly, what I want to emphasize with communication is that it should be two-way. It should be bi-directional. It should be frequent and regularly. It should be culturally responsive, and it should involve some empathetic communication, listening, being present and mindful. And that means nonverbal listening as well. So making sure that we're sitting what we call solar, sitting straight and squarely. We have an open posture. We're leaning forward to who's available when listening, and we have eye contact for attentiveness, and we have a relaxed stance. And then advocacy is building trust through advocacy. So proactive advocacy, and then there's reactive advocacy. So advocacy can lead to positive changes for the student, and it's often very empowering for the families. It can also be incredibly stressful for the families. And a lot of times families feel that the expectation of advocacy is on their shoulders, and that can be a pretty daunting and overwhelming thing. So when educators feel that, when families feel that educators are advocating with them, there's much more benefit to the partnership that takes place. Some of the ways that you can overcome advocacy challenges are focusing on the data, not on the emotions, not on the feelings, not on the person. Focus on the data, document and use those legal guidelines. So using peer-reviewed research. And then I find that facilitated IEPs can be incredibly beneficial when working through advocacy as well. Commitment is the last one that I wanted to talk about, and that is remaining active, willing, and interested. So an educator who is demonstrating committed behavior to the family, a level of commitment to their work and the student, is someone who's flexible and accessible. There's someone who treats families as more than a student, or more than a family, or more than a case. It's more than a job. It's someone who goes above and beyond to resolve issues. It's someone who shows a level of commitment to the student. Organizational citizenship describes instances in which a worker will spontaneously go beyond formal prescribed job requirements and engage in non-mandatory behaviors without expectation or receiving any explicit recognition or compensation. So this is some of the level of commitment that we do see a lot of our educators demonstrating, and that goes very far for families. 4 indicators of commitment in the workplace are volition, which is the conscious choice to work there, bonding, which is forming connections with people, tasks, and activities, dedication, showing strong support for the work, and responsibility, which is holding oneself accountable for their work behavior. Some of the ways that you can increase your own commitment, or educators can be encouraged to do that, are creating a goal of commitment and identifying why, creating and describing rewards for that level of commitment, listing actions that might be needed to follow through with that level of commitment, anticipating obstacles and finding solutions before you go through with that commitment, acknowledging investments that are already made, and managing your existing commitments. And what I want to end is on this note, in that all of the things that I've been describing, all of these behaviors, the facets, as well as our sunshine behaviors that we want to see educators and families demonstrate for the partnership, these are all actionable steps that require forethought, planning, and follow through. Trust is a human virtue that's cultivated through speech, conversations, commitments, and action. It is always a matter of human effort. It can and often must be conscientiously created, not simply taken advantage of. So I hope that one overarching theme that you've heard today is that we cannot simply expect trust. We need to work toward it. And that includes affective behavior and cognitive specifics that we put into place. Thank you for your time. And I know I went a little bit over with allowing time for questions, but I can stay on later if need be. I hope this was helpful.
Thank you so much, Tracy. You've given us so much to think about, so much information. Again, this will be recorded on our webinar. If you would like to go back and listen to it again and think through our slides, but we really appreciate you sharing this information. We do have a couple of questions. One is from a professor, and the question came early on when you were presenting and said, do you recommend these teachings and strategies about trust be offered as direct lessons and activities or embedded within other lessons?
Good question. And I would say both, but I think they need to be directly taught and demonstrated with actionable strategies, practice, etc., that we want our students, our teachers to graduate with and go out using. One of the things we do at UNC is I do simulated IEP meetings. So we don't wait until a student teacher is in an IEP meeting for the first time. We do a simulated IEP meeting, and prior to that, I directly teach them these types of skills and how that looks and sounds like in an actual IEP meeting so they can practice it. So I do believe that these are discrete skills that need to be directly taught and practiced and reinforced and monitored and revised and reflected upon, etc.
Okay, thank you. We had another question, and actually it was from me. But when you were talking, I think you kind of answered it, but I'll let you go through and answer it again. As you were talking about, let me see if I can find it. How can schools address the discrepancy between what the law requires to provide FAPE as compared to parents that might want the school to maximize services? Do you think that sometimes this difference affects the level of trust? Any suggestions on dealing with this? And I will say that I heard you, I think this relates back to your 5 components, but go ahead.
The capital piece?
Yes.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to refer to. I do believe that in order, and I think part of that is a navigational capital. And so I think a lot of what I see I will say a lot of what I see when I talk with families and educators who have been in conflict and have gone to extreme levels and such, is there is that incompatible expectation. And we see a lot of what we call hyper interpretation of the law, which is end all be all. It needs to be all of everything, versus what we know happened with when we look at interpreting FAPE and what is in the best interest of the student. And so I think the discord that happens between what the expectation is versus what the actual law is a lack of knowledge and understanding of it. And so in many ways, providing them, some families and educators, with the information about how to navigate navigational capital, understanding that, as well as social capital, having others who've been there who can help support. Parent to parent support can be very beneficial when you have a family member who's been there and has had a child exit the school system, who can provide the families with some of the realities. Because, and I do feel like teachers want what's best for the child and families want what's best for the child, but there's this misunderstanding of what is legally allowable and can take place between the team. And so having those capitals, those different forms of capital to provide the family with the advocacy skills can be really beneficial in helping them understand why they're where they are and how they can move forward with advocating for their child successfully to have their needs met in the most meaningful way that's allowable.
Are there any other questions? We've had some questions about the slideshow, and they may be emailing you for a copy of the slideshow, or perhaps you could send it to us and we can archive it with the video. We'll talk about that. Okay.
Yep.
I just want to thank you again. And actually, you just have so much information that we're going to glean from you. We'll be talking about this issue some more, because we know that while schools and families listen to this information, you sometimes need resources to kind of help you guide through what you can do. And so I know, just like our professor asked the questions about teaching students, I'm sure that there's directors that are interested in how do you teach these schools within their own buildings. And so we'll look at trying to address some of those options. I do want to remind everybody that next month, we're not going to have a webinar. We're taking off because our webinar Wednesday, or Wisdom Wednesday, takes place during spring break. And I really think that people are going to be having their minds somewhere else during that time. But we will resume in April. We'll do one in April, in May, and in June. And in April, we're going to be having Carlo Rossi come back to Oklahoma and do a presentation on parent-family engagement. And when he came before, he had rousing reviews. He's very animated. And so we look forward to that time and presentation. If anybody has a question that they didn't feel comfortable raising, you can always contact Tracy, or you could contact me actually, and I could send those questions to Tracy. That'd probably be the best way to do it. So thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.